But now that we've talked about the lines of evidence for evolution, or how do we know that evolution is true and occurring, let's talk about how evolution actually works. Let's talk about some of the mechanisms by which populations are going to be changing. So this is Darwin and Wallace here. And they didn't come up with the idea together. They came up with the idea independently, and they wound up collaborating. Darwin is the one that typically gets most of the credit for evolution, but these two gentlemen are the ones that originally formulated the idea. There were a lot of people that came before them, folks like Lamarck, who had some ideas that weren't good. They were good for the time, but they weren't quite correct. Um, but these were the two that first formulated and formalized the idea of evolution through natural selection. So natural selection is the first mechanism of evolution that we're going to discuss. There's going to be four today, by the way, and natural selection is the first. So you probably heard this term, and we're going to kind of pin down what it actually means. So there's a few things that need to happen in order for natural selection to take place. You need to have a scarcity of resources. So there needs to be some kind of competition for resources. If there was no scarcity of resources, there would be pretty much no selective process. If there's enough for everyone to go around, you're not going to need to change. You're not going to need to evolve. So scarcity of resources. You also need some kind of variation in your population. If everyone was exactly the same, then there wouldn't be any need to change, and the competition would be just kind of random, and there wouldn't be any way to get any kind of advantage. So you need scarcity. You need a variety of different phenotypes, and those phenotypes need to be able to be passed on to the next generation. These need to be heritable characteristics. They need to be things that you can actually give to your offspring. Because the idea behind what's happening here is there's a whole bunch of offspring. There is some competition for food, and the offspring that have the right phenotype are going to be the ones that do the best. Because they have done the best, they're able to pass down those characteristics to the next generation. And one of the first places where Darwin observed this was in these finches. You can see these are all, at least 1, 2, and 3, are very, very closely related to one another. They're in the same genus, but they look very different. The reason that they look very different is because in the environments where they were living, they required different sizes of beaks in order to be able to do the best. And so natural selection amongst these birds led them to have these different sized beaks. And the Galapagos is still a great place if you want to go and look at natural selection happening there, not in real time, but in modern time. So people have been studying finch evolution in this century because of droughts that have happened on the islands. And it's actually led to evolutionary patterns that you can see happening in your lifetime, which is pretty rare. But natural selection is the first mechanism, the first evolutionary force that we're studying. And so, so 1977, as I was describing, you can see that there is a shift in the mean beak depth. Okay, and you can see here beaks are getting larger during this period of drought, and it's because they're needing to utilize other resources because some of their resources have gone away. The other sort of canon example of natural selection is the peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution. And so there's two forms of these moths. You have like the melanistic or dark one, and then you have this lighter one. And in essence, what happened is before the Industrial Revolution, there were these birch trees that looked pretty much exactly like the peppered moths. You still had this darker form, but this was rarer. So the original population, you see this curve is higher for these ones. They still existed in the dark form. But then the Industrial Revolution happened and sort of made everything in the United Kingdom sooty, right? We were running machines. We were doing all of these industrial things that made everything darker, which gave this dark form the ability to take a foothold. And so you wind up with many more of these dark moths. And the reason for this is because before, when your pattern looks exactly like the tree you're on, it's much harder for birds to see you. It's much harder for predators to eat you. But then when everything turns dark, if you can imagine this on a dark background, you're going to be very easy to see. You're going to get picked off by predators immediately. So this is, again, one of the sort of canon examples of natural selection. So selection is the first mechanism of evolution that you should know. The second is genetic drift. And we're going to talk in a second about something called gene flow. And yeah, they sound kind of similar, but they are completely different. Genetic drift is the chance loss of alleles in a population. Let me say that again. Genetic drift is the chance loss of alleles in a population. So what you can see here is you had two white bunnies, and one of them was able to pass on its genetics to its offspring, but then in subsequent generations this white bunny just happened to not get to reproduce, and so those alleles went away. So another way I like to think about it is, imagine all of us in this class. Let's say we were all able to get together, and we were just kind of sitting under a tree, and that tree fell and took out half of us. So half of the alleles of our population would be gone. So that would be an example of genetic drift. It's just something that happens by chance. And it again, the way I think of it is just alleles just go away by accident, more or less. So this gets a little confusing. Oh, sorry. So here is a bottleneck event. This is an example of what can happen with genetic drift. And so what it's showing is you have all of these alleles in the original population, but a whole bunch of them go away. A good example of this is like cheetahs in Africa. So cheetahs in Africa have been hunted down to the point where there are no two cheetahs in the wild who are further than cousins in terms of their relationship. Okay, we have reduced the genetic diversity of cheetahs to so low that they're all at least cousins in the wild. Okay, it doesn't have anything to do with the cheetahs in particular. We were just out there shooting them because they were cheetahs. It's not like if you had a certain pattern of alleles, you were going to survive being shot or you were going to not be shot. But because human beings like to shoot stuff, we decimated cheetah populations, and that is an example of genetic drift and the bottleneck event. So bottleneck events are sort of like a subtopic of genetic drift. And in bottlenecking events, what happens is the population gets reduced to some very small level, and you wind up losing all of these alleles here. So one way in which this can happen, apart from humans just being terrible and shooting everything, is imagine some group of, we'll say, squirrels winds up getting stuck on an island. Okay, so you only have these alleles on the island, right? All of these alleles aren't there; they're not there anymore because these squirrels happen to swim out to this island, and that would be a bottleneck event. It would also be an example of genetic drift. Okay, so yeah, chance event or catastrophe can reduce the genetic variability within a population. Okay, so what do we have so far? Natural selection, genetic drift, and you should also kind of get what bottlenecking is talking about and how it relates to genetic drift. So gene flow is not the same as genetic drift at all. They are completely different. Please do not mix them up. Do not confuse them. Make yourself a flashcard, whatever you need to do. But genetic drift is the chance loss of alleles within a population. Gene flow is just migration. They should call it migration, probably, but that's neither here nor there. Gene flow is you take a group, or you take an individual from one population and they migrate to another population. And so now this brown beetle is mixing up with all these green beetles. It's got its alleles getting mixed in there. Okay, that is the third mechanism of evolution, is the third evolutionary force that causes evolution to happen. Migration or gene flow, whatever you want. The last mechanism of evolution, and the only way in which new alleles, new variation can actually be introduced into a population, is through mutation. So I said a very, very loaded sentence just now, but natural selection doesn't introduce anything new, right? It just kind of selects things out. It removes things. Gene flow can actually introduce new alleles to a population, but those alleles already existed somewhere. So that is a way that you can introduce new variation in, although from an existing source. And genetic drift is just reducing again. You're getting rid of stuff. You're removing alleles. So mutation is the only source of new genetic information that is available to populations. Okay, and so that is just the literal. You're literally changing those letters. You're changing those base pairs, which is going to cause a protein to change, which is going to cause a difference in that. So the four mechanisms of evolution: mutation. The four mechanisms of evolution: mutation, changing your DNA; gene flow, migration from one population to another; genetic drift, the random loss of diversity within a population; and natural selection, organisms competing for scarce resources and then passing their genes on to the next generation.